Yeah. Welcome to Leading Safely. Let's start the show.
Hi again, welcome back to the Leading Safely podcast. This podcast is supported by HSI DoneSafe, smart, simple safety software that works where you do. It's easy to use and set up the way that you need and helps your whole team get on board with safety. You can track all your safety tasks, your risks and reports in one place. No more paper, no more mess. From the site to the boardroom, DoneSafe gives you clear, live data so that you can act fast and mitigate risk. Find out more at donesafe.com. So today I want to talk about accountability, human error, and one of the biggest traps I have seen in safety, leadership, and incident investigations. Because for all the times that people say they want accountability, what they often mean is punishment. They mean someone has to wear it, someone has to pay for it, someone has to be warned, disciplined, fired, prosecuted, or publicly named, so everyone else can feel like the matter has been settled. But that is not accountability. That is closure dressed up as leadership. And if you work in a high-risk industry, you already know how this story goes. Something happens, everyone is shocked, the pressure is on. The organisation needs answers. The media wants a face. Leadership wants certainty, and investigators start digging. Then somewhere in that report, usually far too early, the phrase appears: human error. And somehow that gets treated like the mystery has been solved, as if identifying human error is the same thing as understanding human error. As if saying a worker made a mistake is the same thing as learning how that mistake made sense at the time. And this is exactly where Sidney Dekker's The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error is such an important foundation. The book draws a sharp line between what he calls the old view and the new view. In the old view, human error is the cause. In the new view, human error is the starting point. It's a symptom of deeper trouble in the system, not the final answer. That shift matters, because once you label human error as the cause, you stop looking. You stop asking what conditions shaped that decision. You stop asking what pressures were present. You stop asking what trade-offs were being managed. You stop asking what the worker could actually see from where they stood in that moment. And you definitely stop asking what the organisation had been normalising long before that event showed up on a dashboard. That is why blame is so dangerous. Blame says one person is solely responsible or at fault, while everything else fades into the background. The tools, the procedures, the staffing, the training, the production pressure, the mixed messages, the design flaws, the drift, the gap between work as imagined and work as actually done. Blame collapses complexity into a single person, and that feels satisfying for about 5 minutes. Then 3 months later, the same event happens again, and everyone acts surprised. But they should not be surprised because they did not fix the system. They punished a person. Dekker makes this point in a way that is still uncomfortable and still true. If you conclude human error and then respond with retraining, reminders, tighter procedures, or punishment, you may not have learned anything useful at all. You have just recycled the old view. The worker becomes the problem and the wider conditions remain untouched. And let's be honest, many of us have seen this firsthand. I have worked in high-risk industries for over 17 years, and I have seen investigations stop at human error like the job was done. Someone did not pay enough attention. Someone failed to follow the procedure. Someone made a poor decision. End of story. Except it never is the end of the story, because people do not come to work to do a bad job. Dekker's argument is that if you want to understand human error, you have to understand why what people did made sense to them at the time. Not from our hindsight, not from the boardroom, not after the outcome is known, from inside the situation with the information, goals, pressures, and uncertainty that they were dealing with. That is a radically different question. Not who failed, but how did this make sense? Not why didn't they do better, but what were they up against? Not who do we hold accountable, but what would make it safer for the next person? And that brings me to accountability. I do not believe that accountability is something you hold over someone's head. I do not think it is something that you can force into existence with fear, as if holding a newspaper to someone's throat is going to make them suddenly accountable. And I definitely do not think that accountability is some kind of debt that gets paid off through a warning letter, a suspension, or a termination. That is treating accountability like an account. Like once somebody pays the bill, the organisation is square. It's not. Real accountability is forward-looking. It's about whether we create the conditions for truth to keep flowing after something goes wrong. It's about whether workers feel safe enough to tell their story before the next event, not just after the last one. It's about whether people believe that speaking up will lead to learning instead of humiliation. Dekker gets close to this in his chapter on responsibility, where he argues that you cannot hold someone accountable for something they had no authority to control. He puts it bluntly: accountability requires responsibility and requisite authority. If a worker is formally responsible for an outcome, but is operating within constrained authority, limited time, incomplete information, production pressure, and organisational trade-offs, then simplistic calls for accountability misses the point. That idea should completely change the way we talk about accountability, because a lot of what gets called accountability is really a refusal to examine authority. We expect workers to own outcomes they did not fully control. We tell them that safety comes first, and then we measure them on output, schedule, cost, and inconvenience. We say, follow the procedure, and then we make the procedure completely unworkable. We say, stop the job, and then we punish delays. We say, report mistakes, and then we act shocked when reporting dries up after someone gets publicly sacrificed. That's not accountability. That's organisational dishonesty. And the field guide is very clear about what happens when punishment becomes the main response. It stifles the flow of safety information. People hide mistakes, they stop reporting irregularities. Real work goes underground. The organisation loses visibility into the very conditions that create risk in the first place. That point is huge, because information is the lifeblood of safety. Not slogans, not posters, not disciplinary memos, information. Stories from the field, near misses, workarounds, moments of confusion, signals that something felt off, places where the procedure and the real world did not line up. If workers believe those stories will be used against them, many of those stories will never get told. So yes, there is a debate here, and some professionals point to a 2022 study about the FAA's compliance program as evidence that less punitive approaches can worsen safety. That study found an association between the FAA's 2015 shift towards a more collaborative compliance approach and increase counts of incidents and accidents and runway incursions in the post-change period. The paper is real and it should not be dismissed out of hand. But that is not the same thing as proving that prosecuting or punishing workers is the answer. First, it's just one study. Second, it studied a policy shift at a system level, not a simple before and after of blame works. Third, the Government Accountability Office said in 2020 that the FAA had not yet evaluated whether the compliance program was actually improving safety, which is a pretty important limitation when people try to use the study as a slam dunk in online debates. And fourth, the FAA's own reporting programs are built on the idea that people are more likely to voluntarily disclose safety issues when there are enforcement-related incentives and protected pathways for reporting. The Aviation Safety Action Program, for example, explicitly says its focus is to encourage voluntary reporting of safety issues and that enforcement-related incentives are part of the design. So my view is this. Even if someone wants to argue that punishment produced some measurable benefit in one context, I still think there's a much deeper question. What does that response do to the future flow of information? What does it do to trust? What does it do to whether workers will ever tell you about the next close call, the next mistake, the next workaround, the next silent drift towards failure? Because a safety system that gets fewer stories is not necessarily a safer system. It might just be a quieter one. And quiet can be deadly. This is where I think the conversation often gets distorted, especially online. People frame it as blame versus no blame, but that is too crude. The real issue is whether we're willing to distinguish between blame, accountability, learning, and culpability. Blame says, you caused this. Learning says, help me understand how this became possible. Accountability says, what are we going to do now at every level to mitigate the risk and reduce the likelihood? And culpability, when it genuinely exists, is never a narrower question about malicious or deliberate misconduct, not a catch-all label for every bad outcome. If we flatten all of that into punishment, we lose the ability to think clearly. And when organisations lose the ability to think clearly after failure, they tend to become performative. They do things that look strong instead of things that are useful. They rewrite procedures that no one can follow. They retrain people on problems training did not create. They remove one worker while leaving the trap in place for the next one. They call it accountability because that sounds responsible. But it is not responsible if the likelihood is still there. To me, accountability should sound more like this. Can you tell me how that action made sense to you from where you stood? Can you tell me about what pressures you were under in that moment? Can you describe to me what the procedure did not cover? Can you tell me what a normal day looked like for you? Can you share with me what signals were already present? Can you tell me what you think needs to be changed so the next person is not cornered by those same conditions? That is the type of accountability that builds memory. That is the kind that strengthens reporting. That is the kind that keeps people in the conversation. And maybe most importantly, that is the kind that treats workers like partners in safety, not liabilities to be managed after the fact. Because safety is not created by fear. It's actually created by people. People adapting, noticing, speaking up, recovering, improvising, and constantly holding together systems that are far more fragile than the paperwork admits. Dekker's central point is that systems are not basically safe by themselves. Safety has to be created through practice, by people at all levels of the organisation. So when we respond to failure by silencing the very people who create safety, we're not protecting the system, we're actually weakening it. That does not mean that nobody is ever answerable. It means answerability has to be honest. It has to consider authority, not just responsibility. It has to separate good faith error from that reckless, malicious disregard. And it has to aim at learning, not theatre. Because if the only thing that your accountability process produces is fear, then what you're really managing is not safety, it's optics. And optics do not stop repeat events. Learning does, truth does, stories do. So maybe the question after an event is not who do we blame? Maybe it is what truth are people now too scared to tell? That is the question I want more leaders, investigators, and safety professionals to sit with. Because once people stop talking, the next event is already underway. Thanks for listening. If this episode resonated with you, why not share it with someone who still thinks that human error is the end of the conversation? And more importantly, take a look at your own organisation and ask whether your version of accountability invites honesty or suppresses it. Because the difference between those two things can be the difference between learning and repeating. Until next time, stay curious.
Thanks for joining Leading Safely as we end our show. We hope you found an insight that will help you grow. Keep exploring, keep learning from all that you do. Ask better questions, stay curious, and just be true to you.